Every day, the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. Violence and violent images permeate more and more aspects of our lives. And I think it's time to draw the line.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Ronnie Ersenbach, and this is the Band Media Podcast, where we will be talking about the art that crossed that line. The Misfits, punk icons with over 40 years in the horror business. They have songs about killing babies and sex with Jackie Onassis after JFK was assassinated. But this week's episode is not about the Misfits, but rather a teenage fan of theirs by the name of Mike Diana, who named his self-published art zine after the Misfits song, Angel Fuck. Now, obviously, being a Misfits fan person isn't what lands him on their show. There are lots of Misfits fans, including myself. Even the grave stuff. I know. Send me hate mail. Mike Diana is the subject of this episode because his follow-up to Angel Fuck, Boiled Angel, got him a criminal conviction for artistic obscenity. It was the first and so far only in these United States of America. Fun fact about the Misfits. After parting ways with lead singer Glenn Danzig, brothers Doyle and Jerry Only formed a Christian metal band called Kryst the Conqueror. Christ was spelled with a K because, well, metal. Officially, the band would last until 1995, when Jerry Only reached an out-of-court settlement with Danzig that allowed him to use the Misfits name again. But back to Mike Diana. Mike Diana was born and raised in New York, but when he was 9, him and his family moved themselves down to Largo, Florida, because, well, of course this would happen in Florida. As a kid, he was interested in art from an early age. His parents had even enrolled him in an after-school art program back when he was in New York. Fun fact, there was one project where they were supposed to make a collage out of seashells that they found at the beach. Diana instead decided to use beach garbage and a dead fish. Born and baptized Catholic, just like his younger brother and his younger sister, he grew up not a big fan of the church. As a kid, he loved the stained glass windows, but the image of Christ on the cross disturbed him. By age 16, he was out. The final straw for him was he hated donating money to the church collection basket after having to sit through sermons about how listening to popular music would lead to burning in hell. Another source that started to fuel his anti-religious sentiment was the work of Jack Chick, better known as Chick Tracts, which Diana describes as sick. For those who don't know, Chick Tracts are these small evangelical comics that are about 3 by 5 inches and usually 20-ish pages long, with 1 or 2 panels per page because it's so small, and it's all old school fire and brimstone type shit. Usually about a sinner that was on their way to hell. Whether or not they escaped the clutches of the devil, well, that depended on the tract. Make no mistake though, it was aimed to put the fear of hell into whoever read it, especially kids. Frequent subject matter that found its way into Chick Tracts' crosshairs included homosexuals, global warming, evolution, Dungeons and Dragons, Catholics, Halloween, and really the list goes on. With over 250 titles, they had plenty of room to attack all kinds in their long history. The interesting thing about these comics was the distribution model. True believers would buy them in bulk and then leave them in public places to be discovered by others. These included leaving them in return library books, public parks, giving them to waiters in lieu of a tip, and, for me, the most egregious, handing them out instead of candy on Halloween. Ironically, Jack Chick's extreme views in these comics and his unconventional distribution model led to both loathing from other Christian groups who felt like he did a disservice to the faith, and piqued the interest from fans of underground comics, the type of art that Chick Tracts was aimed at stopping. The first time I ever came across a Chick Tract was when I was a kid, and it was the public restroom of a Shakey's. The first time my kids ever came across one was down at our local park. It should be noted that I have never come across Mike Diana's work in the wild. Also, the general conservative atmosphere of Florida at the time inspired Diana to pursue a more graphic nature with his art. In school, Mike Diana wasn't the greatest student. He got failing or just barely passing grades in all of his classes, with one notable exception, and that was chemistry. No, I'm kidding. It was art. Of course it was art. High school is where he started to draw his own comics, inspired by the likes of Topps Ugly Cards and Wacky Packages and Creature Feature Cards, also publishers like Heavy Metal, Creepy, Eerie, Basil Wolferton's Plop, Bernie Wrightson's Run on Swamp Thing, and the work of Jack Davis. Not to mention the underground comics from creators such as S. Clay Wilson, Greg Irons, and Rory Hayes. Now, before we get to his art, I think this would be a good time for this week's trigger warnings. We will be talking about artistic depictions of rape, sexual violence, pedophilia, and graphic violence. We will also be talking about real-life murder and rape. A quick side note. Look, I know this is the 5th episode, and it's the 4th time that rape has made it onto the trigger warnings. I want you to know that this is not a subject I take lightly. Given the subject matter of the show, it's a hard topic to avoid, but it's on my radar now, and I will do my best to at least spread it out a little bit so it's not so back-to-back. In the meantime, if you have been the victim of sexual violence, there is support, and an organization called RAINN, RAINN, operates a national sexual assault helpline. More details are available in the show notes, but you can call anytime, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at 800-656-4673. Okay. Back to Mike Diana. Towards the end of high school, he began to mix his love for these grotesque art forms with his own abilities, which he had been cultivating for years by this point, and he started to draw cartoons of unpopular teachers being graphically killed. He handed some of these out to school friends, and he also submitted them to horror magazines, but they were all rejected. After high school, he would spend all night working on his art, and then during the day, he would work in his father's convenience store. His first attempt at self-publishing would come in 1988. He had a friend by the name of Robert who had gotten a job in a print shop. Robert convinced his boss to let him print 960 copies of a zine him and Diana had collaborated on called HVUYIM at cost. Of course, with the provision that they did all the labor themselves. Diana had gotten a taste of publishing and would go on later that same year to print his very own zine called, any guesses? Angelfuck, which I personally will never grow tired of saying. Ran for 3 issues before Diana moved to releasing the digest-sized Boiled Angel. If you want a good reference for a digest size, think a TV guide. If you're young enough that what I just said makes no sense, then just think like a DVD case or a manga. Diana's work, particularly in these, were highly cartoony, featuring nudity, violence, caricature of human form, and scatological themes, child rape and sodomy, bestiality, human mutilation, and drug use. Diana's art is so crazy and manic that it's hard to describe. But, fun fact, our Instagram account serves as a visual companion piece to the show, so you can see it there. Or, Google exists. He started off with a run of 65 issues, each of which he signed and numbered. But as he moved to issue 2, the demand had raised so much that he had to up it to 300. Most of his customers were from out of state and had read reviews of Boiled Angels in publication like Fact Sheet 5. We're going a little bit old school for this, so let me explain. Fact Sheet 5 was a publication that laid out reviews and information for all of the privately produced printed stuff at the time, including zines, all stripes of underground comics, and so on. They would have literally thousands of reviews in each issue. It was arguably the most pivotal publication in connecting fans of independent art with creators in a pre-internet era. Which brings me to my next point. 300 issues might not seem like a whole hell of a lot, but pre-internet, it's quite an impressive feat. Love his art or hate it, and I'm in the love boat. Not in the actual love boat, you know what I mean. It was making an impact, not only via his graphic content, but also his style, while cartoony, is very distinctly his own. But how did he print these comics without partner in crime, Robert Bobby Robertson? I had to make up the middle and last name. Who worked at the print shop, you ask? Well, at the time, he was working at a local elementary school as a janitor and would use the school's photocopier after hours. A plan that worked pretty well until he accidentally left some of his copies in the machine. He was fired, and I'm guessing not for stealing paper. Now, one might think that has to be it. This is where the arrest comes in, leaving violent pornographic cartoons at an elementary school. And one would be wrong. This is, in fact, though, where shit starts to get really weird. Enter Danny Rolling, better known as the Gainesville Ripper. Around this time, he had just committed an infamous murder spree that would be referred to in the media and the press as the Gainesville student murders. Over the course of 5 days, he had murdered 5 students in the Gainesville, Florida area, ages 17 to 23. He had bound and raped several of his victims before stabbing them to death. Afterwards, he would mutilate and pose the bodies, even going so far in one case to decapitate his victim and place her head on a nearby shelf. He would be caught in September of 1990 on a burglary charge. During the investigation, police would eventually put together that he was in fact the Gainesville Ripper, and he would be formally charged with the murders in November of 1991. In a surprise move at trial, he pled guilty to all counts and later confessed to a previously unsolved murder case in Shreveport, Louisiana from November of 1989, where he had murdered 55-year-old William Grissom, his 24-year-old daughter Julie, and his 8-year-old grandson Sean. It should be noted that he also mutilated, cleaned, and posed Julie's body. Meanwhile, during the time this case was still unsolved, a law enforcement officer in California came into possession of one of Mike Diana's comics. He felt part of the comic reminded him of the Gainesville student murders. Add to that one of the suspects they did have in the case was found to be in possession of Diana's comics. Fun fact, the guy who had Mike Diana's comic? Not Danny Rolling. This was enough to put Mike Diana on the FBI's radar. He was later visiting with his mom, a thing he was known to do, when the FBI showed up at her front door and told him that he was a suspect in the murder case. They asked for a blood sample for DNA testing, which Diana provided. After it was tested, he was cleared as a suspect, so the FBI forwarded all their information on him, including his work, to the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. Meanwhile, Diana went back to doing what he did, working on his comic books. He would also go on to publish Boiled Angel number 7 and number 8, and his own graphic novel, Sourball Prodigy. It was around this time he started receiving letters from a fellow artist named Michael Flores, who had just moved to Largo and was requesting copies of Diana's work. Through the course of his 10 letters, Mr. Flores both assured Mike Diana that he was not a cop and refused to meet with Diana in person. Diana eventually sent him copies of the comics. To I'm sure nobody's surprise, Michael Flores was indeed an undercover cop. Later, Assistant State's Attorney Stuart Baggish would come across these comics, and he would be the one to bring the 3 counts of obscenity against Mike Diana. 1 for publishing, 1 for distributing, and 1 for advertising. Mike Diana had his own theory about why Baggish brought charges, which he laid out in an interview he gave with his then-fiancée Suzy Morbid circa 1995. Quote, "He himself is some kind of comic book collector, and I think it just personally offended him when he saw the material at the clerk's office and decided he wanted to prosecute the case." End quote. Fun fact, Suzy Morbid had been represented by the same lawyer that represented Mike Diana before her and Diana had ever met. She had run into legal trouble for airing some footage of a G.G. Allin show on her public access show, Morbid Underground. Double fun fact, Suzy Morbid now goes by Suzy Solar and is a trance and prog DJ. For the trial, Mike made the very smart decision of contacting the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. The CBLDF is an amazing organization formed way back in 1986 to be, quote, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting the First Amendment rights of the comics medium, end quote. Besides handling the legal costs of numerous cases through the years, they also sponsor Banned Books Week, give away free comics on Free Comic Book Day, and give lectures and presentations at conventions and universities across the country. Neil Gaiman is even on their board of directors. Fun fact, back in 2011, the CBLDF acquired the rights to the Comic Codes Authority seal. The seal was used for decades as the de facto censor for the U.S. comics industry. The CBLDF now plans to put it on merchandise, with proceeds going to fund the organization. Anyways, the CBLDF appointed attorney Luke Lyrot to Diana's case and paid his legal fees, which would end up being about $10,000. Things did not start off well for Diana and his team. First, they tried to argue that the letters from Michael, definitely not a cop florist, were entrapment, but that was dismissed. Then they tried to get the case moved to Tampa, where they might find a more sympathetic jury, but that too was denied. They did have one thing going for them, though, and that's that proving obscenity isn't easy, what with the First Amendment and all. In order to prove obscenity, there is a 3-pronged test called the Miller test. The test itself being established in the Supreme Court case, Miller versus California, about a man named Miller who owned a mail-order porno company and sent out a rather graphic brochure that upset a restaurant owner in Newport Beach so much that he received it and immediately called the cops. Long story short, in order to meet the legal definition of obscenity, all 3 of the following criteria must be met. The average person, applying contemporary community standards, would find the work taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interest. Prurient is a fancy word for sexual. The work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct or excretory functions specifically defined by applicable state law. And last, the work, taken as a whole, lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. For the first prong of the test, Baggish used teen horror movies as an example of contemporary community standards, arguing that Diana's work was obscene where those movies were not, because a typical horror movie, quote, portrays violence in a gross way, but does not portray sex in a patently offensive way, end quote. There was also the matter of prurient interest. Yes, it was extreme, but was it intended to arouse? This is where Baggish brought in Tampa psychologist Sidney Marin. Marin made the claim that people, quote, of questionable personality strengths, end quote, could be aroused by the comic book. Arguably, Diana's strongest leg to stand on should have been the third prong. He had long had anti-authoritarian and anti-religious themes, particularly aimed at the Catholic Church, even taking swings at pedophile priests in his work. Ironically, though, as Robin Bloomer, executive director of the ACLU of Florida, explains, the very political nature of his work should have been what saved it from the obscenity conviction, quote, but in this case, the very political message was inflammatory and helped convict Michael Diana, end quote. It didn't help that Mike Diana was not allowed to enter his collection of underground comics into evidence to show that there was nothing unprecedented about his work. Baggish also made it a point to tell the jury that Diana had been a suspect in the Gainesville murders, despite the fact that Danny Rolling had already confessed by the time the trial started. Baggish would go on to compare Mike Diana and Danny Rolling, and even claim that if they didn't stop Diana now, he himself could become a serial killer or inspire some other poor soul to be one. He also brought up the fact that Ted Bundy blamed pornography for his crimes. Why this factoid always seemed to make people think, hey, you know that Ted Bundy guy? What a trustworthy dude and not at all a murdering sociopath, is a little beyond me, but I digress. In his summary, Baggish told courts, Pinellas County has its own identity. It doesn't have to accept what is acceptable in the bathhouses in San Francisco, and it doesn't have to accept what is acceptable in the crack alleys of New York. Even if we overlook what I will kindly call the borderline homophobia and racism of that remark, it should be noted that the film Porky's is based on actual occurrences at Boca Ciega High School in Gulfport in the early 1960s in good old Pinellas County. The trial lasted a week and deliberations lasted 90 minutes. Mike Diana was found guilty. Diana's lawyer, Lyrot, would later say that the jury was visibly disgusted by what they were made to read of Boiled Angel. Diana would also make the claim that when one juror was asked what their idea of art was, they replied, needlepoint. The sentencing would take place 4 days later. 4 days that Judge Walter Fullerton decided that Diana would be spending in jail with no bail. it should be noted that this is typical for murderers and drug lords, not so much for misdemeanors. Diana had this to say about his days in jail. Quote, "There was a lot of murderers and rapists in there, so they were all saying, 'I'm here for raping and I'm here for murdering. What did you do?' I said, 'Oh, I drew some pictures.'" End quote. Baggish had wanted 2 years incarceration for Diana, but he ended up getting 3 years of supervised probation, a $3,000 fine, $1,000 for each count, 1,248 hours of community service, and was ordered to avoid contact with minors. Fullerton also ordered Diana to follow a state-supervised psychiatric evaluation at his own expense, to take an ethics in journalism class, and ruled that he was to submit to unannounced warrantless searches of his personal papers by the police and deputized probation officers from the Salvation Army, which would allow them to seize any drawings or writings. This conviction obviously angered many civil rights and First Amendment folks. Susan Alston of the CBLDF branch in Northampton, Massachusetts argued, "There have been about half a dozen comic book obscenity cases in the United States, but most involve store owners, and nobody was ever ordered to stop drawing. Diana is definitely the first artist who's been banned as part of his sentence." End quote. Did I pick that quote because it says banned? Maybe. This was unprecedented and insane. Despite the outcry, Mike Diana's appeals weren't much help, although they did manage to get 1 count of obscenity dropped. As it turns out, the advertising obscenity charge stemmed from a blurb on the last page of Boiling Angel number 7 that said, quote, "Be on the lookout for next issue, number 8. End quote. The problem being he hadn't yet made 8 when he made 7, so technically he couldn't have known he was advertising obscenity when he wrote that blurb. Diana was eventually allowed to leave Florida for New York and finish out his probation there. He finished out his community service through the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, who put him to work for Lower East Side Community Garden and God's Love We Deliver, a group that delivers food to HIV patients. He never paid the remaining $2,000 fine, and a warrant for his arrest was issued in the state of Florida. But New York wasn't about to extradite for a misdemeanor, so he was fine, with the exception of he lost the ability to go visit his family down there. It wasn't until this year, early 2020, that Mike Diana was finally removed from probation after 26 years. He's continued his work over the years, even when he was on probation. Mike Diana has been published and represented by Shane Bugbee and Michael Hunt Publishing. And I don't know this for sure, but Michael Hunt Publishing has to be a fake name. Angry Drunk Graphics now publishes this work. One of my favorites of his newer work is the album art for an album called GOP, Gag on Penis, by the band Totally Fucking Gay. For the record, you should listen to Totally Fucking Gay. They are fabulous and a perfect match for Diana's music. Look, Mike Diana went through a lot of bullshit, and at the end of the day, he still lost. And it would seem that those of us that follow or are intrigued by or just adore art from the extremes owe him the decency of remembering the trail he blazed and all that he went through. As it turns out, though, there are still those who carry the torch for Mike Diana, most notably Frank Henenlotter. Yes, dear listeners, director of Basket Case and Frankenhooker Frank Henenlotter, who has directed a full-length documentary about Diana called Boiled Angels, The Trial of Mike Diana. As of this recording, it still appears to be making the rounds in festivals and whatnot, but with any luck, it'll be out for us to watch en masse on streaming services before too long. And hopefully, it will give Mike Diana the recognition that he deserves. Oh, and fun fact, I'll miss you guys. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you next time. Oh, there goes that music again. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Band Media Podcast. Email us at bandmediapodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Ronnie Ursenbach. And please like, comment, subscribe. And if you donate blood, come join our Band Media Podcast team on the Red Cross app. And if you don't donate blood, then think about starting and then do the thing I just said. Well, that's enough of my rambling for now, but Keep being wonderful, dear listeners. Adios.